Hi, hello, and welcome to another episode here of the War of the Rebellion podcast for Age Soul War. I'm the host, Niels Eichhorn, and this is the last time I'm doing one from Austria. Next time it will be in Germany, and I'm joined by my partner in crime again, Andrew Hauk, who is responsible for this time's episode. It was his idea to kind of look into like books that have been published 20 or 30 years ago and kind of look and talk to the author and kind of have a conversation about what they think now about their books and scholarship and changes in that. So um, any criticisms can be directed at Andrew for this.
Yeah.
There you go. He is still in Poitiers and not changing in that regard, but he's looking forward to also not have the Tour de France in the city this year. If you're watching, we're in the middle of that. Our guest, that's the important part, is Anne Sarah Rubin from Baltimore. And yes, that is the Baltimore with that infamous bridge and a very famous War of 1812, actually more minor engagement of the War of 1812 and something important for U.S. history, but not for us, obviously important here. Anne got her PhD at the University of Virginia, and since 2000 is a professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She is the author of quite a few books. Obviously, for my newest project, I'm very much interested in her Through the Heart of Dixie, Sherman's March, and American Memory. But we are going to talk about the other one in 2005, A Shattered Nation, The Rise and Fall of the Confederacy. So, Anne, thank you so much for joining us. Again, this was Andrew's idea. He's the geek in this case, and I'll let him start today.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Well, it really is exciting to talk to you. So we were with Niels. We had talked about maybe doing a retrospective of some important scholarship, and I was reading your book. I mean, I'd used it, like I said, I'd used it a few times for specific purposes, but I hadn't read it cover to cover, and I really enjoyed it. And I realized that it sounded contemporary. It sounded like it was written, it could be written today. And so that was our kind of jumping off point. And I thought, why not contact you and see if you'd like to talk about it? So how do you feel about your book 20 years on? I mean, well, almost 20 years on because it's 19, I think, right?
Yeah, 19. I mean, first of all, I'm gratified that people are still reading it and that it's still really like part of the conversation about Confederate nationalism. I feel good about it. You know, I was just saying before we started that I actually started the book really in 1994 as my dissertation. And I do remember as I was finishing the manuscript for the book and turning it in and feeling like, well, I couldn't make it any better without sort of a time machine and going back and making different decisions when I was starting my dissertation. So it does, you know, I'm glad to hear that it holds up. I do think that, you know, I'm always everyone's always happy to know someone's reading their books still. So I would say that. Yeah.
The reason I asked that is because you know, a lot of the books that I've read, I mean, like we were talking before we started recording, I've gotten myself back up to speed pretty well on scholarship over the last decade or so, and there's a lot of stuff that's dated, really dated. Even things that have been written since your book was published, there are books that are dated, and I don't feel that with yours. Even the way that it's written, in terms of style, and I'd say perspective, have managed to withstand the test of time. Whereas I think Niels, you and I were talking about books like what did we say? We talked about David Blight.
Yeah, we talked about David Blight, especially like the Race and Reunion, right? It's sort of like
Yeah,
when we think of
I mean
memory.
it's a great book. It's a great book, but it is a product of its time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say a couple things. First of all, I think when you read Race and Reunion, you have to think of it as the sort of as foundational, right? So
Mhm.
that it's sort of set the terms of the debate, and then the debate has moved past
Mhm.
it. I think in terms of my book, I made a couple of decisions, or I was interested in a couple of questions, and that I do think made it more lasting. The first one was I was really frustrated with the debate in the 1980s over sort of, was Confederate nationalism quote unquote real? I was
Mhm.
like, this is a not, that to me was an unproductive
Mhm. Right.
debate, because it was real to the people who believed in it, essentially.
Mhm.
Was so I wanted to sort of sidestep that debate entirely and take nationalism and take Confederate expressions of
Mhm.
nationalism on their own terms. So I think that's one way that I think was helpful, was that I tried to be less reactive
Yeah.
to other
Mhm.
scholars.
Mm.
I think the fact that I wanted it to be an all Confederacy book, because there had also been a bunch of books in the 80s that were like, Confederate nationalism in 3 counties, or Confederate nationalism even just in one state. And I felt like you can't be making a national argument
Mhm.
from a limited perspective. Um, so I was very conscious of wanting to do all 11 states of the Confederacy. And of course, the vagaries of where I did my research and where resources were, all 11 states are not evenly represented, but at least they're in there in some ways. And this sense of this nationalism as a national phenomenon,
Mhm.
rather than as a phenomenon concentrated just in like Virginia.
Mm.
And then the other thing I did was I knew that I wanted it to, that most books prior to this about nationalism had sort of had a hard stop in April and May of 1865.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I knew that was not what I wanted to do, that I wanted to stretch the book into the beginnings of Reconstruction, at least,
Mm.
into, I think the reason I picked 1868 was that was when the Southern Historical Society was founded. And so it
Mhm.
was like, here's this moment before the lost cause, right?
Okay.
If you think of the lost cause as being really
Mhm.
born out of the Southern Historical Society and all of their writings and all of that, this was this moment before the lost cause had kind of completely coalesced. And I did realize in the course of writing the dissertation, writing the book, that actually the second half of the book, the reconstruction, the post-war half, is, I think, actually the better half of the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like the first half is fine,
Mhm.
it's good, but it's the second half that's really, I think, where I made the mark.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we both would agree with that, because that's really right where you said like earlier, like this nonsensical debate, right? It's like, is the Confederacy a nation, or is it, what is it? And it's like,
A waste of time.
it's exactly, it's a waste of time. They believe they are an independent nation, and they have sort of their own identity. And we'll talk about identity a little bit
Mhm.
in later on today. But it's like, both Andrew and I, when we talked like a week ago of like, what do we want to ask, what kind of topics do we think most important, it was almost all reconstruction and post-war, because that's really is a key, right? And you kind of so nicely put in a few places in the books, that it's like the state is dead, but the nation continues.
Mhm.
And now, like there's this beautiful passage where you're kind of talking about like, yes, they're now American again, but they're not American at heart.
Mhm.
They're remaining in this Confederate identity, and that
Mhm.
really strikes good, because it's like that's a challenge here, right? Like you're having this nation that still in the United States, but is somewhat separate from the United States.
which I think is really the crux of your book. I mean,
Yeah.
it's that nugget of, I don't know what, that
Yeah.
germinated grain of nationalism that builds and builds, and even at the end it's still there. And
Mhm. And I think too, part of it is, I think one of the aspects that was really important to me is this idea also that people have multiple identities at once, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can't just be, and so people are sometimes, um, one identity takes precedence over another identity. I'm a Confederate. I feel loyal to the Confederacy, but at the same time, I am worried that my wife and children at home are starving. So I'm going to not necessarily desert, but kind of more like go AWOL, right? And come home to help them for a while and then often go back. Right. And so is that an expression of no longer feeling a nationalist sentiment? I would argue no, they do still feel this commitment to the Confederacy. It's just that their familial identity takes precedence for a while. So I think that was also something that I was trying to get at, which is that people are complicated and people make complicated decisions, that you're not all one thing or all another thing. You're both, or you're multitudes.
Well, and then talking about Reconstruction, and even wartime Reconstruction, as the Federal Army recaptured and occupied territory, and it was a question of taking or not oaths of loyalty.
Right.
So do they take them? Do they not take them? If they decide not to, is that dangerous for their families? So that, are they morally coerced into taking them? If they take a loyalty oath, does that mean that they're renouncing their Confederate identity and assuming a Union identity again?
Right. And I think in general, people saw the oath in very instrumental terms, that you take the oath because taking the oath gets you back the rights that you think you are entitled to, but you can still feel this, I think I call it an emotional identity or a sentimental identity, right? It doesn't make you feel, taking the oath doesn't automatically make you feel a sense of loyalty to the United States.
Yeah. It's sort of pragmatic, right? Of like,
It's very pragmatic. Yes,
right,
that's
what do I need? What do I need to do
right.
to be part of the political body again? Right,
right.
Body politics.
Cynical.
Yeah, we can call it cynical too.
Yeah, it's all of those things, but it's pragmatic. And I mean, look, you can't, I think it's hard to imagine a situation where asking someone to take a loyalty oath, I think is probably inherently coercive.
Yeah.
Right? Because you can't, you can't coerce loyalty. You can't.
No. Right? Like, I mean, for the moment you can, right? Like, if you point a gun at my head, of course I'm loyal to you for 10 minutes or 20 minutes or 2 days, and then I'll try to run away.
Right. Or in terms of, I know at some of these state universities, I think in Florida and in Texas, they're talking about wanting faculty to take these kinds of loyalty oaths, or you can't say anything against the state government. And it's like, I mean, I'm the child of a First Amendment lawyer, so my civil libertarian tendencies are pretty tough. But I mean, what is that?
Right,
you can't. How is that real?
Yeah, well, that takes us like a lot of modern problems right there, right?
But that's
like,
just it, right? Is that these issues all have, a modern echo, at least.
Yeah. Well, and there are parts in here that reminded me of contemporary politics as well.
Well, yeah, that was sort of one of the things that we were kind of curious about too, right? Of like where you end the books in 68 was sort of like the birth of the Lost Cause, but really the Lost Cause is sort of a continuation of that Confederate nationalism. So like, where do you see like differences, or do you see like when you look at lost causers today, neo-Confederates today, do you see some of that like Confederate nation identity still there, or how do you think it has changed over the years?
Yeah, those are great questions. So the lost cause today, or the Confederate, so-called Confederate nationalists today, I think have almost no connection to the Confederacy of the 1860s. I mean, I think that so much of the today's neo-Confederatism is less neo-Confederatism and more a sort of harkening back to this imagined pre-civil rights utopia, right? We know that the Confederate flag on state flags and things like that comes really as a post World War II anti-civil rights phenomenon. And so now this turning of the Confederate flag into this kind of generic emblem of rebellion and defiance is very much, no matter how many people say it's heritage, not hate. It's really like, did your personal ancestor fight under the Army of Northern Virginia battle flag? I don't think, in most cases, I would argue no. And my in-laws lived in Maine, and on the road to their house in Maine was a barn painted with a giant Confederate battle flag. And I'm like, what are you doing? You're in Booth Bay, Maine. You are not Confederate. Like, this is not real. And so I find that frustrating, right? This and also a denial, right? When people say, oh, I'm just honoring my ancestors, or my ancestors didn't fight for slavery. Like, but they did,
But
right?
they did, yeah.
Even if you were not your ancestor was not himself a slaveholder, he was white, and he was fighting on some level to preserve a system that elevated him because of his very whiteness. And he was, in all likelihood, aspired to enter the slaveholding class. So it's you can't elide that. I think it's
it's so funny that you bring that up, because you just brought back a memory of like, oh God, it's about 2 weeks ago. We were walking in town, and I still kick myself that I didn't have my phone out to take a picture, but there was this red Peugeot driving by, and on the back was like a sticker of a Arizona license plate, and below it a rectangular Confederate flag. And I saw that, and I was like, what the, and my wife saw it, and we were both like, what's just happened? And I kind of was like, well, it's this, in Europe, you see it a lot of with like biker communities and sort of this freedom, independence kind of thing. And they don't understand like the connotations that this flag has. And it's just so frustrating in that moment.
I would say this too, which is the position that I really had and still have, is right. If I take the Confederacy seriously as a nation, then there's no reason to be, flying the Confederate flag over, a state house, right? Because it's the flag of another nation, right? So like, you don't see people in the United States flying, you don't see the state house in the United States flying the Union Jack or something like that, right? So that was my other issue, which is, right, you can't fly the flag of another nation in a national environment. Obviously, what people want to do on their private property is their business. I don't have a problem with that. You do whatever you want, but you can't have the state sanction of it. And it is so interesting. I wrote this book over, in the early 2000s, when it seemed like the flags and the monuments and all of that would sort of stand. It just didn't seem to occur to anybody that they could just come down, right? And so to look back first from the vantage point of 2016 when Nikki Haley brought the Confederate flag down finally in South Carolina, and that moment, and then of course 2020 when the monument people realized they could literally just pull the monuments down, is really striking to me.
Just throw some rope on it and pull it down.
Right? Like, oh, who thought that? It's a fascinating change to me.
Well, where are you from originally? And are you're from Virginia? Is that?
Ew. I'm originally from New York.
From New York. Okay.
So I grew up in the suburbs of New York City. My parents both grew up in Brooklyn. So I'm the I can't count the generation exactly. My great grandparents came from Eastern Europe.
Okay.
So I always tell everybody, like, I don't have a dog in this fight. I had no ancestors here before the Civil War. During the Civil War, my earliest ancestors came in the 1880s. Most of them came around 1900.
Okay.
So it's definitely a different kind of perspective, right? That I did not, where I grew up was kind of Revolutionary War country, right? I grew up right near White Plains, New York. So the Battle of White Plains and the place that Washington spent the night in and stuff like that. Not really the Civil War at all.
Well, the reason I ask, and this is, I think Niels, when you went to the States at the beginning, you landed immediately in the South, right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
And so you had an image of the Civil War going to the States. You landed in the South. Like Anne, I'm from the North, and from the West Central Indiana is kind of War of 1812, Tippecanoe, that area. So there's a lot more early 1900s, early Republic history. New France with Vincennes, George Rogers Clark, that type of thing. I was interested in the Civil War, but I had no idea how much the Lost Cause actually covered the landscape across the South until what you're saying 2015, 2016, 2017, when you started to see all these maps and the number of the monuments, and then you started to, it's an incredible amount of physical vestiges to this memory, and how incredible it was. And it was, for me, it wasn't even a question, the monuments. Okay, I'd seen them. I'd been to Richmond. I'd seen Monument Avenue. But I didn't realize that they were in so many towns. I mean, more than 1,000.
It's like every small town, every
county seat.
Every
county seat. Yeah, they got the Confederate with the standing soldier. I mean,
yep.
Sometimes
almost
too.
all made by a company, I think in New Jersey, actually.
Yeah.
There was one in Boston. Was there one in Boston too?
Maybe.
And some of the early ones, I remember the one in Macon, I think Tom Brown has it in his book. Is
they
like actually no. It's actually like, I think it was like an Italian statue that they kind of had in a catalog, and they were like, "Oh, this one looks nice. Buy that one."
I'll believe it. But I will say too, I mean, I didn't realize the degree to which there were monuments really in the North either. And, I mean, I grew up, like I said, right? I grew up right outside of New York City. My parents worked in New York City. I went into New York City all the time. And I didn't realize that the statue on Fifth Avenue outside of the Plaza Hotel and FAO Schwartz, where I used to go, the toy store that I would go to as a kid, I didn't realize that statue was Sherman until I started working on my Sherman book. I had no idea. And I had grown up hearing about Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn, but again, that didn't register to me as a Civil War.
Yeah.
It didn't, it's the landscape is sort of invisible until you actually look at it.
If you've been to Indianapolis, I don't know if you've been to Indianapolis before.
I have not.
The very center of the city, Monument Circle, is the tallest of the war monuments, the GIR monuments. The Soldiers and Sailors Monument. It's enormous in the circle downtown Indianapolis, and it was just it was the landmark in Indianapolis, and it wasn't until maybe 20 years ago that I realized it's a Civil War monument. It's,
Right.
and walking around the base of it, you get the story of the Civil War, you get a memory, a story of the Civil War, a narrative of the Civil War, and it is the central monument, the central point of the city. I mean, all roads lead to the Civil War monument.
Yeah.
Yeah, even DC, which I had lived in DC forever. I've been in this area since I actually, before I started at UMBC, I taught at American University for 2 years. So I've lived in the DC area since 1999. And all the circles, right? Scott Circle, Logan Circle,
they're all generals.
War. But again, you don't sort of click into it until you know.
Yeah.
And they're all just sort of there.
I always found that's the most fun part to teach students, right? Of like that moment where you're like, let's just look at all of our surroundings. Our history is everywhere, right? Like
right.
Civil War names, Spanish names, and French names, English names, and all these like, and that's the moment where it's like the history really comes alive because you're walking on historic names.
Right. Exactly. The land, it's everywhere, right? And so then with being teaching near Baltimore, of course, realizing that there are all these Confederate monuments in Baltimore, a city that was a Union city. And
Baltimore.
so how did that happen? And how did we get there? And so that's always something that's been really great to sort of unpack with my students. And it's interesting too. I teach Civil War, and then I teach a couple of Southern history classes. And I always start those classes by asking, I say, all right, everyone who thinks they're a Northerner, raise their hand. A few of them do. Everyone who thinks they're a Southerner, raise their hand. And again, a few of them do. And I'll often sort of pick them out, and I'll say it like, where are you from? Like, where are you from? And, a lot of times they'll be like, oh, I grew up in South Carolina, or my grandparents are in South Carolina, or whatever. But the vast majority of them, because the vast majority of our students are from Maryland, the vast majority of them have this sort of nebulous Maryland. They're sort of like, we're neither, this kind of nebulous Maryland identity or mid-Atlantic identity, which is not nearly as powerful.
You being from New York, where, for you, Maryland is what? Is it?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, for me, Maryland is the middle ground, right? Which is that it had slavery and it was deeply invested in slavery. And I've done a lot of research on slavery in Maryland, and particularly in Baltimore. So in that regard, it is deeply Southern to me. But also I recognize that, Maryland, I was just in Mississippi last week, and Maryland and Mississippi are very different, right? But I look at, Maryland was segregated, right? One of the Road to Brown cases is a Maryland case. So to me, Maryland seemed pretty Southern. It's south of the Mason-Dixon line, right? So, but I would make a distinction between Maryland and the deep South for sure. And even, going to grad school in Virginia, Charlottesville versus, Arlington, right, are two. There's a difference there versus, say, like, Danville or Southside Virginia or something like that.
Oh,
It's a continuum.
Well, for me, Maryland was always, south of Maryland was the South. But the Maryland itself was kind of, and it really, I think what drove it home for me was Frederick Douglass.
Yeah.
Okay, so he was a slave in Maryland.
Yep.
And he emancipated himself. Okay, so he's from Maryland. Okay, so Maryland was the South.
And Harriet Tubman also. Which I don't think it's a coincidence that the two most famous, escapees or self-emancipators are from a border state,
Yeah.
right? You don't have to go that far
Yeah.
to reach freedom.
Yeah, hop on a train and you're in an hour in Philadelphia, right?
Right, a train, a boat, you can even just get across the border.
Yeah.
You can walk to freedom. So
That
yeah,
while
it gives
you
Maryland an interesting identity, I think.
yeah. While you guys were talking, one thing though that came to mind, because like when you teach Southern history or do Southern history, there's always this like, oh, there is not really a South. There's many Souths, right? Like there's all these different like you can't compare North Georgia and Southern Georgia, or you can't really North Mississippi and the Black Belt Mississippi, or like all these different. We get the point, right? But how like this is sort of the challenge, right? So we have this broad spectrum, these many different Souths, but how do we mold that into one nation?
In the 1860s or now?
Yeah,
or...
no, let's go with the 1860s.
I mean,
That's
I think
not-
Back to the book. I mean, we wanted to talk about
Yeah, bring it back to
1860s
the
is
book.
easier. Because right, you do have slavery. Obviously that's not perfect, right? You have 4 slave states that stay in the Union. But it's certainly the depth of investment in slavery, the degree to which their economies revolve around slavery. And I think, obviously Maryland and Kentucky are both quite divided, and the old Avery Craven joke about Kentucky waiting till after the Civil War to secede, I think also really applies to Maryland. Yeah, it's pretty good. Right, that these are states that in many ways become more southern after the Civil War with segregation. I think that's the big, unifying factor. I think it's that's how I always have defined it, is south of the Mason-Dixon line, south of the Ohio.
So you'd say slavery is sort of the like if we kind of think of it like in the sort of imagining of a community of a nation, right? So slavery is the key for you.
Yeah, because I think anything else, right? If you say, oh, states' rights is this principle that unites the Confederacy, it's like, right. And why did they want
states' rights to what?
Right, states' rights to do what? What's the big issue that they're fighting with other states about? And slavery, or somebody once at a cocktail party was like, it was really all about the tariff.
Yeah, right.
I can tell that it was the aquarium where I got told
it
that.
was before Dave Hacker's article, because I said I don't think 620,000 people died over the tariff, when now it would have to be 750,000 people died over the tariff. But right, it's not the tariff. The tariff is about slavery and protecting that institution of slavery. And I think the unwillingness, the perpetual unwillingness of people to reckon with the damaging impacts of slavery and Jim Crow is the problem. And also the fact that people can't seem to separate that just because your ancestors were involved, you don't have to defend your ancestors, right? Arguing that the United States in 1860 was a slaveholding nation and was a nation in many ways defined by chattel slavery is not an indictment of who you are today. Right? It's not. But you have to accept what the past was. You can't sugarcoat it, because you can sugarcoat it all you want. It's still there. I mean,
and we were talking about freedom of speech, and it reminds me of Florida, some places in the South are not allowed to talk about slavery. You're not allowed to talk about things that teachers aren't allowed to talk about things that might make their students feel bad.
Right, which is, of course, I mean, the preposterous, I don't have to tell you guys, right, that the issue is that it might make white kids feel bad, because not talking about it is making African-American kids feel bad, right? But they seem not to, right? They seem not to count, that they're not. So it's just, it's, I mean, you're historians, right? Like, it's incredibly frustrating because if you just sort of get it all out there.
Okay, so you said slavery for you would be the kind of the binder,
Mhm.
in the the mayonnaise of the South. Um,
I go with
sorry,
imagining, but that's
yeah,
okay.
the mustard and the mayonnaise. I don't know.
I mean, that's fine for me because I really dislike mayonnaise, so I'm
Yeah,
comfortable disliking both slavery and mayonnaise.
yeah,
Just don't bring escargot into the conversation,
Yeah.
Andrew.
yeah. So sorry. Just that. Um, what about the institutionalization of white supremacy?
That's trickier because, of course, white supremacy is present in the Civil War North.
Yeah.
And there are, laws against African Americans voting in the Civil War North, right? I mean, part of the issue that forces the 15th Amendment is that Northern states are not willing to change their voting laws.
Yeah.
So it's more complicated than just white supremacy. And I think, too, I mean, one thing I did, having grown up in New York, is the distinction, right, between de facto segregation, de jure segregation, and the degree to which the school districts in my county, it had to be desegregated also, right? Even though there were never black schools and white schools, you have neighborhood schools, which are de facto segregated. And so the town that I lived in, that I grew up in, lived in when I was little, I'm my parents' younger child. My parents were involved in the desegregation of that school district, which involved, right, in going from neighborhood schools to, there was like a K-1-2 school and then a 3-4-5 school, right, to try to balance that. And isn't it true? I think now the New York City school system is like one of the most segregated, if not the most segregated in the country. So
Really?
yeah.
It's
Because
bad.
it's residential segregation and white, wealthy white families sending their children to private school. And so,
Of course, if you listen to conservative speakers, it's like, oh no, it's not white flight. It's
right.
they've been, it's a choice, and they got discriminated against because now they had to go to school with people they didn't want to go to school with and all of it.
Right.
But yeah,
and the biggest, the Boston busing crisis in the early 70s, again, right? That's not de jure segregation, that was de facto. So that's why I feel like it's easy to say the South is the problem child of the United States because they're racist, but we're not racist. When in fact,
the North was
the
pretty
whole
bad.
country is
Reminds me of the trolls on Twitter, the neo-Confederate trolls on Twitter. Will the cosplayers will throw up a meme with some racist quote by Sherman. So yeah, the Northerners were racist too.
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, I wrote a book about Sherman, and I think there were a lot of things
which I have read, by the way, and I didn't realize it was you.
Yeah, it's me. But it's easy for me to kind of like Civil War Sherman. I and the Civil War section of Sherman's memoirs are so eloquent. But then I have to remember, right, that then Sherman goes out west and I mean, even Civil War era Sherman was horribly racist.
Yeah.
But he's not actually an admirable figure. He's good at one thing. He's good at war, but he's not a great guy, right? And the genocides perpetrated against Native Americans and nobody's hands are clean in the past.
Yeah.
No, it's funny where he says that, and like I'm still waiting for LSU to name a building after Sherman. I hope that will happen in maybe my son's lifetime.
Yeah. I mean,
That
I'm a big proponent of don't name things after people because nobody's everyone has
no,
feelings.
but I just love the squirming that people in Louisiana have every time Sherman comes up and they are reminded, like, yes, he was the superintendent of your main flagship
He
school.
loved the South.
Yeah.
He loved white Southerners. So it's all the more complicated, right? Nobody is
But
simple. He always maintained, right? You can stop this anytime you want.
yeah. Well, but it reminded me of after Charlottesville, I did a little thing with Trey Wellburn and Mark
Mm.
Smith, where we three of us got together on campus and did a little thing of like, let's talk about these Confederate monuments and Confederate history and everything. And always reminds me of John Oliver. We had sort of the Confederate Santa Claus in the audience, but there was this one African American community activist, and he raised a very interesting question that he said, like, I live on Jefferson C. Davis Street, and I don't think that's a good name either. And it took us a moment to be like, Jefferson C. Davis, oh, that guy, right? And like that totally spoke to that racism of like, here's a U.S. general for
Right.
whom a street is named in Macon, Georgia, but who, of course, has all kinds of racist problems during Sherman's march.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't think living on Sherman Avenue, if I were Native American, would feel too good. I mean,
Oh,
that's why
yeah,
innocuous names, trees, flowers.
yeah, that works. All right, since Andrew asked about white supremacy, I'm going to do my advisor fine and be like, okay, Grady McWeeny, cracker culture. How do you feel about ethnic aspects with sort of like Southerners sort of having that Celtic background and that makes them distinct?
I didn't know you were a Grady McWhinney student. Oh, that's
No,
interesting.
Dan Sutherland
Dan
was.
Sutherland, of
And
course.
of course,
Lovely.
everyone who graduated from Dan's group had to read Grady McWeeney's Cracker Culture.
I mean, look, I think that calling, Gettysburg one of the great Celtic battles is maybe a step too far. I do think there's
Did not agree with
there's a white, a kind of poor, a Scots-Irish white, uh, poor white culture. But I would argue that again, right? They're not so outside the um, larger milieu of the
that.
South that, with the exception of certain areas, right? Sure, you have Eastern Tennessee, which is very unionist. You have,
Mhm.
pockets, right? I mean, the Free State of Jones, but in large part, poor whites go along with and
Mhm.
do not resist secession and war because, again, white supremacy is beneficial to them.
Mhm.
The old line, what did we call it? Herrenvolk democracy, that we called it. I'm sure I've massacred the German, but that
That
we
was
call,
actually pretty good.
yeah, is in fact it's true,
Mhm.
right? And it is, I mean, it is, I think the story of American history is going all the way back to Jamestown, right? If you unite whites regardless of class, that protects the ruling class because otherwise you're either going to have racial lines or class lines, and the white ruling class is safer, frankly, with a racial distinction than a class distinction.
That, of course, then the strike of 1877 hits.
Mm-hmm.
And that complicated.
But one of the
Yeah.
big reasons I think that you don't have and the sort of European model of social democrats and just in
Mhm.
general, like why isn't there socialism in American history, as much socialism in American history, is the use of race and ethnicity to constantly be dividing the
Mhm.
working class.
Yeah.
Well, then again, the use of socialism there um, is, of course, in and of itself problematic because what you're talking about exactly is social democracy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the
Socialism.
fact that that the white working class, the fact that Trump is so beloved by most of the white working class today, when he wouldn't, spit on them if they were on fire, to me is inexplicable. I mean, I can explain it, but it makes
you chose a more elegant analogy than I would have chosen. But
it's just it's this, that's the great sort of tragedy of Southern history too, is right, the populist movement and this brief moment where you could have had at least some,
Right.
fragile but class unity. And then when that's broken, it's broken. And you don't really see it again, even really until the 30s. And even then it's fragile.
Yeah. Race is powerful in that. That's
it really is.
So I don't know. Can we? I had a question. You talk about ethnicity, Niels, and then I have not read Cracker Culture.
Don't.
I was reading the synopsis on my other screen. Okay, all right. So one of the things I did enjoy about your book as well, just to go back to this, is the kind of the ideological origins of all this, with the North and South, the Cavalier, the Roundheads. You also talk about levelers. You talk about the English Revolution, or you talk about the English Civil War. You talk about the Glorious Revolution. You talk about all sorts of key moments in, I guess, relatively recent Anglo-Saxon history. Recent, relatively speaking. Could you talk a little bit about
the English origins?
Where did you
get that?
where did you encounter this stuff, that type of thing first? How did you go about researching it? Did it kind of come organically, or did you hunt for it?
I definitely don't recall hunting for it. I mean, if I had to say anything, it came from, and I can't believe I'm blanking on who wrote the book. The book Cavalier and Yankee, which who wrote that? You guys can look that up. I'm like looking at my bookcase, but of course, most of my books are in my work office. A lot of it, I was really influenced also, I will say, and again,
William
Taylor, yes. Cavalier and Yankee, really influenced by Bertram Wyatt Brown and Southern Honor, which I thought was really powerful. And also, I mean, my own advisor, Ed Ayers, had written Vengeance and Justice, his first book, which really meshed well with Wyatt Brown and Southern Honor. I mean, a lot of what I was writing against at the time was actually the Why the South Lost, which Grady McWhinney was one of the authors of that, wasn't he?
Yeah, and then it was.
I keep turning because I'm looking at my bookcase.
I've got it somewhere.
Yeah, it's a big book. It's like
they did How the North Won and then Why the South Lost. Which was, I had a lot of problems with that book.
Davis was in that group, and
and they were arguing that part of the reason the South lost, again, this sort of soft nationalism, was like people felt guilty over slavery, and I was like, no, they really didn't. No, there was no latent guilt over slavery that let people sort of not fight as hard for it. So that's kind of where all of that came from. I didn't do any real deep research into that. That would have been primarily out of secondary sources, and then maybe just looking at the language that they were using.
Well, I think that's the key often with those things, right? Like what's a language? How do they like connect themselves to other nationalist movement? What kind of inspirations do they use? And like that was Duncan's section in our book on like the kind of Lincoln, Cromwell, like English Civil War, American Civil War comparison. That
and I did much more with the degree to which the Confederacy drew on the American Revolution. Really grabbed hold of all of that iconography and Washington and Jefferson and all of that as this bid for, I argue, bid for legitimacy, right? They're taking in the Revolutionary War a usable past. And they very carefully allied, the fact that like, oh, there was actually a revolution in the North, and like there's no John Adams in their version, right? It's all Washington and Jefferson and Nathaniel Greene, and so it's that where they're very self-consciously using that.
I haven't read it yet. It just came out. Michael Haddam's new book on 1776.
Yeah, I just saw
that.
It just came out. I mean, I've been.
Well, there's a book we can do.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to it for years now because he's talked about it, but it got me to thinking about the 4th of July, and I don't know if you historians at the movies, Jason
I know it. Yeah.
The podcast that he does, they talked about Gettysburg. The episode this week talked about the movie Gettysburg. And one of the things that you've seen it, I'm sure.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that kind of struck me in thinking about it yesterday as I was driving home from work. I'm on vacation, by the way, officially now. A summer vacation. So driving home from work yesterday. It was the 5th of July. And I was thinking about the 4th, and in the movie Gettysburg, they, on the 3rd, one of them mentions, oh, it's almost the 4th of July. Oh, I'd forgotten about it because, so in your book, you talk about them revering, obviously, the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, and then you talk about after the war, the 4th of July being the celebration for African Americans and not for the white South. So Confederate Memorial Day becomes the
right.
the celebration. Did they? This is an actual question. Was July 4th a holiday in the Confederacy, or was it part of the national? Did it remain part of the national, I guess, calendar?
I think it was, but it also the bigger holiday in the 19th century, I think even bigger than July 4th, was Washington's birthday. They in the Confederacy loved Washington's birthday. So they did Davis's inauguration was on Washington's birthday, things like that. So yeah, I think they did celebrate it. But not as much. I might be wrong about that. It's honestly,
but they wouldn't have forgotten about it like it was portrayed in the movie Gettysburg.
Well, I think you forget about it because you're in the middle of this huge battle, and so you just don't think about what day it is.
Yeah, they're sleep deprived.
Right? They're like, I don't know what day it is. More than I think.
They're staying up late drinking and playing cards too. So.
Yeah, but I guess right, the degree to which the 4th of July is also about celebrating the flag and things like that. But no, I think they still celebrated 4th of July.
I think I remember there was somewhat concerns of like, ooh, Vicksburg surrenders on the 4th. Can we do it like a day later or earlier?
Right. Well, and then there's that whole not meme, but kind of myth that, well, they never celebrated the 4th of July again in Vicksburg, or like it took them till the 70s. I mean, Black people still celebrated it. People still celebrate.
Yeah, of course, right. But that's sort of like and I know in like there's so much diplomatic correspondence of like these guys in everywhere writing in of like, we had this 4th of July party at our building, and like all these people came, or like there was like a parade in front of the building. You're kind of like,
and I mean they still do, right? Overseas. I think every embassy has a big 4th of July party. So
it's like,
does Haddon's book, do you know, does he go up through the bicentennial?
I don't know. I don't know. And I'm really looking forward to reading it because his first book was fantastic. And
I'm showing my age because, of course, I actually remember the bicentennial. I was a little kid then, so I remember the going to New York City and going to somebody's apartment and watching the tall ships.
Oh yes.
I was born 2 years later.
Yeah.
I taught that in my survey courses.
Oh really?
Yeah, there was like a big like oh, it was like the whole bicentennial was just a mess
Yeah, the
because of like
quarters.
no, because it was like there was like this desire for like all these kind of commemorations and like it, yeah, messy stuff. No, it would be interesting. All right, it's on the list now. Andrew, we'll do him at at some point.
Fantastic.
Yes, yes. Uh,
Uh,
you also have like since I forget where was this started, where interesting started. Um, women. That was another one that you
yeah,
kind of really strongly emphasized in your book as sort of like race we already had, like religion was a
Right.
big one, but like the role of women, like I mean that's always a key part, right? Of like when we think 19th century, like yes, they can vote, but there's other ways how women can kind of
Right.
foster
Right.
national identity and political identity.
Yeah, and it's very much sort of a form of Republican womanhood, right? This
Mm,
idea of having Confederate women and how they should be raising Confederate children and the role of these, the fact that there's these Confederate textbooks are published and again to sort of train up Confederate children, and then the ways that women are both pushing Confederate nationalism and
mhm,
forcing Confederate nationalism. I love Drew Faust's book, Mothers of Invention, except
mhm,
for and I taught it for years and I do really love it. I don't love, and I've always really pushed hard against her conclusion that it was women withdrawing their support from the Confederacy that doomed the Confederacy, because that again gets into my idea of these conflicting
mhm,
loyalties.
mm,
Um, and I do think, my book really focused a lot more on elite women. And I think Stephanie McCurry, for example, which again, I don't necessarily agree with all the conclusions in her book, but I think she did a great job bringing working class women into the story
mhm,
of nationalism and the importance um, of their resistance. But again, this idea also that it's women who have to bear up a lot of these sacrifices,
mhm,
that it's the women at home who are really struggling to keep the nation going, and the degree
mhm,
to which they're suffering is putting pressure on the Confederacy. The book that I'm working on right now, actually, I'm looking at hunger and food shortages and starvation
mhm,
in the South during the Civil War. And a tiny bit of it actually grew out of um, some of the work I had done for my dissertation and actually took out for the book. Um, so looking at, but what I've found is that I'm much more interested in questions of poor relief and how are, uh, even just local people trying to support these soldiers' wives, because soldiers' wives are becoming actually a real political constituency.
mhm.
and
Man.
they had to tread a very fine line um, between
Mm,
uh, support and overstepping, because
Yeah,
if they overstepped, then they were entering the realm of manliness.
yeah, yeah, and just the degree to which women also are careful to portray themselves, right? When women
Mm,
are writing to governors for food, or even going to sort of local grandees for food, they're very careful always to portray
mhm,
themselves as wives and mothers of
mhm.
soldiers, and therefore worthy of support. This is white women that I'm talking about, of
of
course.
course.
Well,
Uh,
yeah, and that's the challenge, right? Of like you are a poor wife of a farmer, and you have to do all the hard work. You don't have slaves that can do the work. You can barely
right,
sustain your family, right? And then of course you have the plantation mistress who has an overseer and 20 slaves or 30 slaves that can like do everything. And it's like there is a big divide between these two kind of like but and then you have the bread riots, right? And it's like
right.
all of a
And the
sudden
bread
the kind of
riots are all over. They're not
yeah,
just
it's
Richmond
not
and Salisbury and Atlanta. I mean, they're happening all over on a much smaller scale.
yeah.
Uh, Yeah, and part of what had brought me into this project that I'm working on now is you have all these elite women complaining about, oh, we have nothing to eat and blah blah blah, or we're eating this and that, and what it really means is they don't have the food of the elite. They don't have white flour. They don't have white sugar.
Mm.
So they're eating cornmeal. They're eating molasses, and what that then sparked the question, which is like, well, if they're eating the food of the poor, what are
Mm.
the poor eating?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay.
Right? And the
Yeah.
answer is not a lot.
Yeah.
And often being supported by, state grants of food, but then also often, right, having, if you're a poor farmer, or even if you're a plantation living on a white plantation, right, it doesn't really matter to you which army comes through. Every army is going to take your food.
Yeah.
So it's getting
They're
into that.
indiscriminate in that.
Right.
It reminds me of medieval Europe, actually,
Yeah.
in many ways. No, I mean, one of the most interesting classes I had when I was an undergrad was on 17th century France,
Mhm.
and you know,
There were a lot of wars at that time.
well, wars aside, poverty
Mm.
was so endemic, and
Yeah.
people, it wasn't even subsistence farming. It was literally not having anything to eat. I mean,
Mhm.
you could be a subsistence farmer and still owe your dues, your
Mhm.
dues to your lord or whatever. But when it came down to it, what did you actually ingest?
Yeah.
So what did you make your bread from?
Mhm.
And this this professor Kevin Robbins, he gave us examples of people in some parts have actually using bark of trees for part of their flour. I don't know how widespread that type of thing was, but if you're talking about um, people in white people in the South complaining about or and complaining about not having the food that they're seeing their elite neighbors having, so white
Right.
flour, the food of the rich, food of the refined stuff, sugar, white sugar, I don't know what else, real coffee maybe,
Mm.
um, wine. I don't know what else.
Yeah.
And you're seeing yourself, having to have, of course, cornmeal. You're having to do something with the chaff from the wheat. You're not having. You have to deal with chicory. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
what people below you eating exactly?
Yeah,
It's just
it's
kind of a
exactly that. And of course also the issue is what are enslaved people being
Mhm.
fed, and then what happens when enslaved people go to the Union Army and wind up in refugee camps, and the Union has to feed them, but the Union doesn't want to feed them. And so it's a pretty complicated story.
So are you looking at the Freedmen's Bureau as well? And
Yeah, I'm going up through the famine of 1867, where there you have the Freedmen's Bureau, and you also have a bunch of Northern relief organizations that are feeding white Southerners,
yeah, that was okay.
1866 and 67.
Because I think you in your book you do talk about white relief
Yeah,
from unhappy white people receiving aid from the Freedmen's Bureau.
right. Yes, yes. And then I found, again, in doing research for this book now, that also there are cases where the Freedmen's Bureau and the case that I found is from Mississippi. It still may be the Army doing it, but they're actually giving more food to white families than they are to black families
Hmm.
in 1865, like May and June of 1865. Yeah, it's all entangled.
So, do you have an explanation for that? Were there more white people than black people?
Oh, no, they're giving them different sets of rations. So
Oh,
black families are getting corn and peas, and white families are getting corn and peas and sugar and rye coffee.
oh.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
very racist.
food segregation.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really striking. And white women are noted in the records by name as Mrs. So-and-so, and Black women are just a Black woman with X children. Really interesting.
Wow.
Yeah.
Talk about violence.
Yeah.
That
No,
goes
it's
back to
really,
our earlier point, right? Northerners were just as racist as Southerners
absolutely,
were.
absolutely.
Like,
You know, it's yeah.
What were they, Northerners or Southerners who were administering?
Northerners, Union officers, Union soldiers.
So they weren't Southern Unionists.
No, not in the records that I'm talking about. No.
Okay. All right.
This is in Jackson, right after Jackson, Mississippi, right as the war ends.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a set of receipts basically that I was looking at.
Okay.
crazy.
Yep. And yet crazy, and yet not all that
Not really. Yeah.
right?
And believable. It makes
Right.
sense.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. Oh, now I remember it. I was going to ask when you were talking about women, right?
Mhm.
Elite women, and like it's sort of interesting when you think of like that that challenge, regardless of who you were, rich or poor, you struggled during the war years. You questioned the nation eventually. You questioned the state eventually. You were losing your commitment, right? And
Mhm.
that's sort of the beauty when you take it into Reconstruction, and that generation that's born, grows up, matures during Reconstruction, says the KKK's liberation, quote unquote, of the South. And that's, of course, then the kernel around which the UDC gets constructed. That thing takes this whole romantic new form of Confederate nationalism. And it's sort of it's almost a rewriting of their history in that moment. Like they forgot all the hardships.
Absolutely. The UDC, they completely forget all the hardships, or they reframe the hardships as sort of a triumph over hardship. And I do think it's fascinating the power that the UDC has, and the degree to which the UDC becomes the keeper of the flames rather than the sons of Confederate veterans.
Yeah.
They're just not as big of an organization. And I don't know that anyone's actually figured out why that is. That people look very closely at Karen Cox's work, for example, on the UDC, but there's the sons are just not, they're just not as powerful as the daughters become. And the daughters are so powerful. I mean, the daughters are the ones who are raising money and erecting all those monuments everywhere.
Right.
Coming from the daughters.
I seem to remember somewhere reading of like it was sort of not something man engaged in, right? Like, oh, it's not, but it is funny when you think of like that dynamic. And today it's the exact opposite, right? Like the UDC is hardly ever in the news, and it's a sense of Confederate veterans who are always
I
up
think
in
the
arms
UDC
about everything.
just kind of keeps itself quiet.
Yeah.
Well, otherwise they lose tax exempt status like they did.
Right, they lost it, didn't they, just now?
Yeah, in Virginia. Yeah.
Yes, that museum of theirs, right?
Yeah. Right next to the Virginia Museum of History and Culture and the Art Museum. And actually, right, if you've ever, I don't know if you've been to Richmond lately, but there's a giant Kehinde Wiley statue called Rumors of War that's installed on the grounds of the Virginia Art Museum, right facing facing the UDC headquarters. That is, this sort of incredible rebuke to the Monument Avenue statues. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
It's been 30 years since I've been there.
It's changed a lot. I mean, the monuments are gone.
For the better.
Yeah.
Change for the better. There we go.
Yeah. No, it's wild.
Crazy.
So one of the things that I really enjoyed, one of the themes that I enjoyed in the kind of the course of the book, from say the beginning and like the birth of the Confederate identity, through the war, as the war began as things began to go against the Confederacy. But it went from the theme, it started with optimism, and it went on through hope, and then little by little, the hope turned to doubt,
Yep.
and then the doubt turned to collapse with the defeat,
Mhm.
and then the defeat brought it into the lost cause. But the idea, the hope that especially the women maintained for their new nation was incredible, and I found it amazing how strong that hope was all the way through the book.
Yeah. And yes, I mean, I tried to be empathetic to people, and right, the degree to which they're hoping that this is going to work and that this is going to happen. I do wonder, like hearing you talk about it now, and maybe I'm, 25, 30 years more cynical than I was then, is also right, the degree to which people write down hope and they maybe don't always write down despair. I don't know.
Yeah, despair is the word I was looking for. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, that people don't seem to, you certainly, there's a culture of no public expression of despair, right? Everything is always super rosy, and victory is always just around the corner. And so there's a degree to which that seems hardly possible. And people do write about despair. I mean, but I think it's the natural, I don't know, maybe it's also people's natural inclination to be hopeful. They
Yeah,
do
because even
to hope beyond, I think, a real rational
yeah, I mean,
point.
especially it was really striking when you're talking about, as rumors of things
Yeah,
began to encroach, the even the little towns across the South, lines of communication were pretty well cut, but the rumor mill was going
yeah,
full steam. Um, there was doubt, but the hope was kind of still there, pushing its way through. Maybe it was self delusion.
I think there's a ton of
Yeah.
self-delusion.
Yeah.
There's a lot of self-delusion in the South in general, right? There's this self-delusion that enslaved people love white people
Mhm.
and would never hurt them or leave them. And so much of the bitterness and anger that you see right after the war is the realization that, oh, actually, enslaved people are going, formerly enslaved
Mhm.
people don't want to be in this subservient position. I think,
A shocker.
right, no, go figure. I think too, maybe there's a kind of like the sunk cost fallacy at play in the Confederacy too, which is they've given up so much and they've made so many sacrifices, and so you don't want to believe
Mm.
that
Mhm.
that it was
Yeah.
wrong all along.
Yeah.
Um, I
Well,
think there's that.
and then what they've given up, I mean, because so many have lost all their sons.
Mhm.
Right.
Right.
Right. I mean, just the human sacrifices of the war are incredible. And that's the other thing, one of the things I always say to my students is when the war is beginning, and is that nobody knew what it was going to cost. Nobody went into war expecting 750,000 people were going to die. Right? They might have made some different decisions then. But it's just the numbers are so unfathomable, and the scale of devastation is so unfathomable.
Mm.
That would be interesting. That would be an interesting counterfactual. Yeah,
Right.
we can't. Thankfully, we can't do that one.
I have a
You want
question
to do
about
the?
architecture. What structure of your book?
Mhm.
Niels, do you have something? Did you want to chime in with this last?
You do your last questions and I do my last question. How about that?
Well, okay.
Yeah, yours is
So
architecture.
one thing that I enjoyed as well, and this is a question about structure, and I'm working on my PhD thesis
Mhm.
as we speak, and I really enjoyed the interludes,
Yeah.
and it was a different structure that I'm used to seeing. because you have the meat of your chapters, but then you also have these really important little nuggets that you're able to dig into for
Mm-hmm.
5 or 6 pages uh,
Mm-hmm.
that help understand the bigger context, and without which the book would be lacking something.
Mm-hmm.
How did you come up with the idea of the interludes as opposed to incorporating those different ideas into the chapters?
Yeah.
Sorry about the question.
No, it's a great question. I'm trying to think back to 1999.
Yeah, sorry. I mean,
No, it's okay. So the
like it
biggest
was
thing I
yesterday, right?
changed from the dissertation was really especially the war chapters were really chronological and had this kind of ebb and flow of like responding to events, and it made it a little tedious. And so I think what I did with the interludes was used them. I really wish I could remember exactly why I did it. I think I used them a little bit also because I was like, I don't really know where this fits. Like the one that I remember the best is the one where they talk about the guy having the vision of the white bales of cotton kind of marching. Um, but I think that's sort of what I tried to do, was stuff that didn't quite fit anywhere else, but that was almost too good to let go of. I put it in those. And it did work.
It did, yeah.
Yeah.
I did like that. And I sort of like books that are like that. Amy Taylor's book about the contraband camps, Embattled,
Mm-hmm.
Refuge, she also has a lot of those kind of stories interspersed. And I know the hunger book that I'm writing right now, I am thinking about a set of chapters that are kind of spatially oriented, and then shorter chapters that are about different kinds of food. So like a chapter on coffee, a chapter. So,
Oh.
but
So, in
but
other
I
words, they're going to be palate cleansers.
yeah, exactly. Snacks. Right. I know. I thought I was like, oh, I could make a menu, but that's like a little too cutesy. Um, I think though, I will say that if you're thinking about that when you're writing a dissertation, sometimes a dissertation, you just want to get it written.
Yes.
So
Get
that's
it done.
and structure is hard.
Mm.
I know for myself writing this hunger book, I've really struggled a lot with the structure, in a way that like this book, I feel like the structure was pretty straightforward. And certainly my Sherman book, the structure kind of revealed itself to me very easily. Um, so I don't know how helpful that is, but
I mean, you answered the question. I just wanted to kind of highlight the fact that the interludes were
yeah.
it was interesting. It's an interesting way of doing it. And was there any pushback from UNC Press?
I don't think so. Actually, no, not that I recall.
Usually
Because
it's the
I don't know how
reviewers
much
that push
freedom.
back and they're like, that doesn't work.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I think the press was really pretty open to it.
Hmm.
Um,
That's-
yeah.
Okay.
Sometimes also copy editors, that are like, no, we don't do that. And like,
No, they were great.
yeah.
I had a great, and UNC Press does a lot of first books. But I've had a great experience with that press. Both of my main books have been with them. So
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks.
Well.
I'm done with my questions.
okay.
Oh, I get the final word. So I was actually curious because obviously it's been 20 years. We already touched on like the guys you wrote against, sort of in the
Mhm.
80s and 90s. So how do you feel about the last 20 years and scholarship regarding sort of the Confederacy as a nation, kind of
Yeah.
Confederate nationalism? So was there any book where you were like, man, I wish I had said that, or why do we rehash this old debate again? Were there any kind of moments where you're like, "Ooh, this is good. This is great
I
new
mean,
ideas," or
I think there's been a lot. I think the fact that in the last 20 years, people aren't debating the sort of strength of Confederate nationalism. I think that's great. I think there's been a lot of more exploration of the kind of culture of Confederate nationalism in Bennington's book and Mike Bernath's book. I think the real freshest work has been the internationalization of it. So a little bit of Don Doyle's work, and then Ann Tucker's book, The Newest Born of Nations. And also, I'm trying to think, I just read it for something. But the idea, Americans tend to be very, oh yes, that book is fabulous. But Americans tend to be very we think we're exceptional, right? American exceptionalism is always at play. And I think the degree to which people are now doing transnational work and saying, oh, well, the war is happening no longer. The war was not happening in a vacuum. This nationalism is not happening in a vacuum, right? It's happening all over at the same time. And I just read a book maybe last year that looked at it looks at the United States, it looks at the Civil War, and it looks at I want to say like Argentina.
Oh, Evan Rosera's book on
Yes.
Yeah.
I really like that book, Evan Rosera's book. Yes. I can't think of the title either. But
Reconstructions. Like
whatever.
I know the book, yeah.
We're thinking in the same book. So I really like that. I like Dan Tucker. So I think that's the most sort of profitable or most interesting direction to go in with it.
Yeah. And just for the record, I did not pay or encourage or send any email to kind of encourage her to say that.
No.
I just want to be clear that since I'm working on that subject, I'm not, not pushing that on anybody here.
So yeah, I think that's where it is.
Yeah, it's interesting. But yeah, it's go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say that ties in with Niels and I both. I mean, we both have this transnational experience for
the
Civil War anyway.
Yeah, I think it's valuable. I mean, I think Americans we think everything is exceptional.
And these guys did not live in a box, right? It's like they knew things that were going on, and they read these nationalists
and the comparative is also valuable, just to say like, oh, well, what is a sort of uniquely American and what is in fact maybe just inherent to a civil war, inherent to rebuilding after civil war.
Well, yeah, right. Or as a nation that continues after the state falls.
Right.
A lot of living in Austria, that's what a lot of Austrian Habsburg lands suffered under. Like, oh, we perceive ourselves as Czech, but we're under this Austrian ruler.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be nice?
I started writing the book right around the time that you had
that's Yugoslavia,
in Rwanda, in Central Africa, the Balkans. Like, it didn't sort of matter. I just would sort of update, if I gave a talk, like update the new nationalist anecdote for the time. That it does still seem to be, it's a sort of perennial issue, this idea that these national identities are constructed and reconstructed, and what endures and what doesn't.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to give you the one last chance, Andrew.
Well, I mean, and then for me, you're talking about enduring and going through, ending in 1868. I think is a great. It's not arbitrary, and it's a great opening to. It's a great door, a gateway, to allow to see where Confederate national identity is going to go, as opposed to being, the door being closed, slammed shut with Lee's surrender, or with Jefferson Davis's capture, or any number of little independent anecdotal endings.
Yep.
When it didn't end, right? That's the thing. It did not end. Lee surrendering did not mean anything for the Confederate mind frame.
No, and I think the degree to which recent, the last 20 years of scholarship on violence during Reconstruction
Mhm.
really shows that that it didn't
Yeah.
end.
Right. All right, we are well over close to an
Yes.
hour and a half at this stage, so we should close for today. Again, and so much thanks for coming out and indulging us here. Almost 20 years that a Shattered Nation is now around, and still a like still a big topic. The ideas issues with regard to Confederate nationalism.
Well, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me, and hopefully I will see you guys again sometime.
Absolutely. Um, yeah, it was really nice talking to you. It was a great book. Holds up, withstands the test of time, and yeah,
Yeah,
like
not as
Confederate
easily
nationalism.
torn down as a statue.
Let's hope. Thank you.